one more time, last time. Today my lecture will be mostly about shift from Soviet architecture to time of independence, of Ukrainian independence, architecture of the 90s and 2000s and nowadays. And for me it's also a very important topic and very interesting to research this topic for me because it's also architecture that surrounds us during all our life, and we live somehow in this architecture. So much more louder. Okay. It's okay. As we know, the collapse of the Soviet Union was on 1991, and after this transformation of the architecture also appeared. That's why all architects that yesterday were Soviet architects, they tried to find themselves in a new reality. But it was not so quick, maybe even as they wish. So it was somehow a slow process. And on this picture, you see a diploma of the best project all over Soviet Union in residential houses award. And this residential house was built not by a common typical project, but by a unique one, and it was finished exactly in the 1991 by architect Vladimir Shevchenko, who is also a well-known architect nowadays, and during the Soviet period he was the author of I can say even well-known over the world Hotel Salute, that is on the cover of our book. And it was his last project, and on the honor of this project he get opportunity to visit Italy and France, and it was also very important for him like an architect and a great opportunity for a Soviet citizen. But we see in this architecture that it already trying to find new forms and meanings, and it's like postmodernism architecture, but it also still is Soviet architecture, and it was very difficult to finish this project because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and collapse of all building process and construction process to get in there all materials and so on, but it was finished, and even more, Vladimir Shevchenko got his own flat in this building and he's still living there. But after 1991 till 1993, he was still working at the scientific project institute that is called Kiev Project. It was the main one in Kiev. And architects trying to find some projects, but it was in a new era, and it was not like it was previous time when the project was bringing to their studio by the head of the institute, while he was get it from some of the government members or government institutions. Nowadays, architects trying to find projects by themselves, but it was also a great pleasure for them, because after collapse of the state, there was also collapse of the architectural state offices, and it was the time when architect became themselves, and client was going not to the scientific institute, but he was going exactly to this or that architect. So he went to the name of architect. And on this picture, Volodymyr is second from the left, And the first from the left is Alexander Komarovsky. He's one of best friends and also well-known architect of the 90s. And they are standing in the model of unfinished project. It was finished only on a paper, but we see here a new forms of architecture, of postmodernism architecture. That architecture started going up and playing with different forms. And this was another project, elementary school, together with kindergarten, and this project was also unfinished. But Vladimir very liked this project because it was also, before this time, he can't even imagine that he could play with some forms and bring some new materials. But unfortunately, this project was unfinished because the client was moving abroad, and it was maybe even non-finished from the first point of this project, because at that time to build up a school and kindergarten was unbelievable opportunity. And another friend of Vladimir Shevchenko, Viktor Kudin, he is well-known architectural caricaturist, cartoon maker, and also architect, and they are close friends. This is some pictures of Viktor Kudin that are laughing at residential boxes of the Soviet period. So, in 1992-1994, there was hard times in Ukraine and also in Kiev. And one day, they entered our house of architects and saw there on the wall application call for applicants to get a job in Germany. And they made their proposal, and these German architects from the city Cottbus, it's East Germany city, and they entered this project institute or project firm together with Viktor Kudin. And this project was the last project of Viktor Kudin during the Soviet period. Unfortunately, it was also not finished and is still in this condition or even worse condition, because a lot of elements was stolen during last 30 years. But this was one of the most interesting projects of the time because it was a huge sport complex, and he gets this project exactly from Sherbysky, who was the head of Soviet Ukrainian Republic, and he was very fond of football team Dynamo Kiev, and he decided to make a sports football arena for this team to play during winter time. And also this project was not finished because of the Soviet collapse, and at that point Viktor Kudin and Vladimir Shevchenko left Ukraine and entered Germany. But after projects with this scale and this difficult construction forms, they got a project to make some pavilions in a zoo for some kind of animals, and shifting also of the scale from huge project to a small pavilion was rather surprising for him, but they remember this time that they entered for themselves a new world of architecture when they don't need to do all the drawings. They just need to bring an idea and set for engineers and constructors like task what they're gonna do, maybe make some details, and then went to library and study learning German language. So they were very fond of this work, and later they got much more new huge project. But at the end of the 90s, they come back to Ukraine and took part in some competitions. And we see already here some kind of architecture of the 90s. It's situated exactly in the center part of Kiev on Khreshchatyk Street. And another one is a residential house district. And another hero of that time is superhero, is the chief architect of the Kiev, Sergei Babushkin, who is second from the right. And you see on this photo also Volodymyr and Vitaly Klitschko, our famous boxers, and Vitaly is now the mayor of Kiev. And it was also at the time when some guys from a criminal world were together even with architects. And Sergei Babushkin, while he was chief architect, he also had his office, and being a chief architect, he get all projects and bring it to his personal studio, and he became maybe even more than a mayor of the city, and he became a very rich person. For example, he had a sea liner, his own, and traveled using it to Venice Architectural Biennale, taking with himself all his studio. So he became, a lot of citizens of Kiev didn't like him at all, because he started to use the city as a business project. And this is my collage reflection on this time, because they started to use not only like the whole territory of the city, but mostly the central parts of the city. And as we know, Kiev is an old city, and a lot of territories during even Soviet period were preserved and was under control of non-building processes. But during the 90s, everything changed. And the most famous project and controversial project and scandal project was renovation of the main square Maidan. And everybody was unhappy with this project, except Sergei Babushkin and mayor of the city of that time, and some new developers, because this square was one of the favorite places of citizens and urban life of the city, and there was very attractive, beautiful fountains, and the sculpture of Lenin and other Soviet heroes were demolished exactly during the 1991. So it was any other symbols of the Soviet period. It was a very attractive urban public space, but they decided to renovate it, and they do it in a manner of the architecture of the 90s. On this picture you see the main column with a sculpture of Ukrainian girl, I don't know how to say. And you see that this kind of architecture is extremely different from the Soviet modernism and even postmodernism era, because architects started to play with a history and just replay this history in the same way, but using maybe sometime new kind of materials. And it was a huge project. The central city district was completely closed, and nobody was happy with this, and they put a lot of unnecessary forms, glass forms there, and some of architects have an idea that after this renovation of this main square started also the renovation of Ukraine, because this project was finished on 2000, so during the millennium, and we know that in 2004 Orange Revolution started exactly on this square, and then Maidan, and then today's war, and so on. Somehow it connects with politics, and after this, Sergei Babushkin even proposed a new form on the square. It should be a business and a hotel building. That the idea is that it is Ukrainian flag, but still now nobody can imagine that it could be built exactly on this plot, but he believes that we need to build much more higher and higher and higher and higher. And this is another project of Sergei Babushkin. So he had some chief architects in his office that were doing this kind of architecture, but now you see another shift from the idea to the reality. And you see that the up form was added not exactly with the original project, but it was added because of propose of the developer, because he started to becoming a bankrupt, and he asked Sergei Babushkin, we add some more levels and everybody will happy. He said, okay. So nowadays it's the biggest and the tallest building in Ukraine. But as I know, not a lot of people are working there, so it's like more office building with, of course, picturesque view from inside, but not from outside. And it's situated also in some kind old parts of the city near Arsenal plant. And I reflected on this building in another collage. That's if we started, let's do it all over Kiev highlands and close friend of Sergei Babushkin, Yana Shvik. He was a well-known architect of the Soviet period, and he works exactly with government members. He was making projects, for example, for embassies of Hungary, France, Poland, and making interior design also for Sherbitsky. So he was the author of another scandal building in Kiev, it Hyatt Hotel, and it's situated exactly in the old town, not far away from St. Sophia Cathedral. And by his idea, the beauty of St. Sophia Tower is so beautiful that we can't add anything to it than a mirror in which she will see itself and she will love itself in the mirror of the Hyatt glass facade. And also it was a new kind of architecture consisting of new opportunities of construction, because at the end of the 90s, a new technology of the concrete monolith was already in Kiev, and that's why this architect could build a new building on a small plot in the center of the city. And another famous project of Yana Shvik is, it's called like a wave house, and he named this architecture as a new Baroque architecture. And also is situated on a small plot, and it closes panoramic views to the left bank of the Kiev. And as I know, all these upper floors are still empty and nobody living there. And at the end of this period that we can name the period that starts from the 1991 and ends at the 2008 with economic crisis all over the world. But before this, architects started to do everything they could imagine, and they can stop doing projects, just like bubble projects, and it's also my collage, you see, was not alone at that time, because architects were thinking also in this way. And I don't remember, and I don't know the name of this architect, but I think that this project is saying more than the name of him or his studio. This is a hotel in Crimea, and this one is my favorite. It's called Divo Sweet, like Wonderland, and it's playgrounds and different functions for children. And it was built during from 1997 till 2014 because of different reasons. And when it was finished, it was quite colorful at that time. And we see that this building, it symbolizes this era because somehow I think that this architecture, when it was built, it was the same as it was projected in architectural application at that time and its versions of that applications. That's how architects, after drawing desks, trying to make architecture on the screens, on the computer screens, and we see what happened after this. For example, these camels that are in real dinosaurs, they were made exactly from the model, library model of the ArchiCAD application of that version, and it was made already finished. And meanwhile, the chief constructor of these camels, dinos, he was 12 years ago the chief architect of the monument of the motherland. That is one, I think, of the greatest construction monuments and engineering monuments in Ukraine. But I think it's the picture of that time, and it was very expensive project, and it works not for a long time because it was not so good financial and business project, because as we know nowadays children and all playgrounds for children are attached to some shopping malls, so you don't need like a special building for this. And the owner, developer of this building, he sold out this building nowadays, and it's mostly abandoned, or you can visit second-hand inside this building. And at the end of the 2008, 9, 10, we see what happened with the city. It's Pechersk district, also one of oldest parts of the city. And we see this architectural rubbish, I don't know, and nowadays it's even more than on this picture. So trying to reflect on this, we published a magazine together with Viktor Marushenko School of Photography that was about architecture community time. And we try to make dialogue between citizens, between neighborhoods, and between developers and architects. Because after Soviet Union collapse and after even 90s, everybody was doing what he wants and didn't ask anybody if somebody agree with it or not. And as a result, we have so polluted and bizarre city nowadays, because Kiev was one of the prettiest cities in the Soviet Union. It was the greenest one in Europe at the end of the 80s, but nowadays it is not. And after this, the territory of around the Kiev, it was shifting all over more and more, and developers started to build new residential houses exactly in the fields without any infrastructure. And it's not the one problem. Another problem of the city is uncontrolled advertising all over the streets. and a lot of new small temporary forms of small business, something like this. And the third problem is that these new residential buildings mostly are built using Soviet technologies of prefabricated concrete panels, but even during the Soviet period it was 90 level high buildings, but today we see that it's just 20 and more. And the quality of this living space is the same as it was 20, 30 years ago, unfortunately. And because of this, people started to fight against developers, because it became a typical situation in Kiev that you can get up early in the morning and see the fence that catch the playground of your children or some green zone, some park, and after that you will see next day a building construction process on it. So people started to fight against developers, but developers started to fight against the neighborhoods, inviting some Nazi and rights and new generation, like a developers' police. And it became also a new typical situation in Kiev. And these photos were made by Maxim Trebukhov, who was shooting this process during 10 years. So he had a great archive. And another story of Orthodox architecture that became also a new symbol of new life, when you can add a dome, a cupola on anything you want, and it became a church. This one is situated on the roof of another residential house. It's like a personal chapel there. I will tell more later about Orthodox. And another representation of our time is as a typical public space, like in Soviet supermarket. And to save Soviet modernism architecture, some guys decided to put it on their body that will exist while they will be alive. This is Lev Shevchenko. He is one of the first members of group of people who were interested in Soviet architecture. So he puts the statues on his body, and on the left lower photo you see Le Corbusier portrait. And the quality and professionalism of the builders of all this architecture, and of course process of decommunization, which this photos was taken during 2014-15 by Evgen Nikiforov, who is author of the book about decommunization Soviet mosaics. And this process was somehow controlled by the government. A number of monuments were listed that should be demolished. But nowadays we see a new wave of decommunization process that is absolutely uncontrolled. And during time after Maidan, it was another representation of Ukraine to paint everything in blue and yellow of national flag of Ukraine, and even to repaint Lenin to Cossack. And another situation was of a new life of residential block houses and of course of its first floor, when a private business came to a public space, and public space came to a private territory inside residential block houses. You see here everything you can even imagine, like photo studio, like barber shop, Bureau of Translation, and so on. And Odessa-based architect group that is called MNPL, like Monopoly, they try to define what is happening on example of order, of a traditional element of architecture, a column, and looking for any combinations and copies of column that could be even imagined. So at the end of the magazine, there was a picture that asked the question, what will be next? Will we go further to build more and more square meters, or we will change our cities in a better way? And after like result of publication was also exhibition in Arsenal in Kiev. And after this, Основы Publishing House published two books in a series of Chick. The first one was a balcony Chick, and it was the author is Alexander Burlaka, and it was about balconies. Of course, balconies is a very important part of architecture, and people use balconies from the ancient times, from the Egypt period, when Pharaoh was saying something to Egyptians, or popes, or presidents. There are a lot of examples when people saying something important from the balconies. And the typology, balconies appears like a necessary element to the architecture at the beginning of the 20th century. And there is one research project that's saying that the balconies was like but aid to help people with miasms, illness, if you know, yes, with lands. Because when you enter the balcony, you get sun basins and you get fresh air. So after this, during the Soviet period, balconies was also attached to each project, and it was extension of the living place inside the flat, because in these flats were living more people that should be, and the balcony was additional square meters where you can put everything you need, adding there shelves, wardrobes, and put inside everything. And nowadays it became, you see, like even more. And for example, during the Venice Biennale, Rem Koolhaas also fixed his attention on the balconies. And during another Venice Biennale was Georgian pavilion that was called Kamikaze Balcony, because the same story is also in Georgia and even more. And this one is one of my favorites. So this owner of this flat is a sailor, and he decided to add a boat to his balcony. Meanwhile, this building is listed as a monument of architecture of the 1920s, 30s. And there are a lot of examples and fantasy of these balconies. This one is in Odessa. It's somehow like Art Deco. And I made also some kind of reflection on Sasha Burlaka's book. Made my own project that was represented in Kharkiv. And one of the most famous element of these new balconies is some elements from the doors from buses and trams. And I decided that it could be like a new glass system of the facade with this frame from these doors from buses and trolleybuses, and we can make a new typology. Just make a project of all this kind of balconies and named each balcony, and you can choose like a neighborhood what you do prefer. Because there was also tradition in the beginning of the 90s, architects made a ready-made project and they named it in the name of a man, of a woman, like a project that is a private house that is called Anna, or private house that is called Volodymyr, and so on. So we can name also these balconies because some of them is really pretty one, and I sometimes think that architect or engineer is living there. And it's also very contemporary, I think. And the next book was Orthodox Chic, and from cave to wagon, it's my sign to this lecture, because I'm very fond of this topic, and that is why I am personally from architectural family. And my father, he started his practice during 80s, and he was struggling against the Soviet government to stop demolishing churches and cathedrals at that time. And he always took me and my sister to some old churches and cathedrals all over. At that time we were living in Sumy region, in Slobozhanщина, and we always going somewhere in Kharkiv district, the region, or Poltava region. So as for me, churches and cathedrals are very favored. And after the 1991, my father became the first, let's call eparchialny architect. So the story is that you couldn't build and make project of the church if you are just an architect. You need to be signed by a pope or monk that yes, you could. So my father was the first one in Ukraine, and during the last 30 years he built a number of churches and renovated a lot of them. On this picture, father is presenting a model of monastery to our second president, Leonid Kuchma. And this one is renovated by my father, and I remember from my childhood when it was abandoned. And I show you these photos from the previous lecture because during the Soviet period it was avant-garde wave of architects to study church and religious architecture because it was not so popular at the time, and it was abandoned mostly, demolished. Nowadays, mostly territory of Ukraine is under Orthodox Church. Only on the West Ukraine we have Catholic and Orthodox Catholic Church. And the first Christians in Ukraine, exactly in Kiev, were living in the caves. And have some great examples of this kind of architecture in the history of Ukrainian architecture is St. Sophia's Cathedral that was built in the 20th century with architects from the Constantinople, but then it was ruined and it was rebuilt in the 17th century in a new style that we called Ukrainian Baroque or Cossack Baroque style. And St. Sophia Cathedral is also important for Ukraine because of its interiors, and also we can set a bridge from these interiors even to the Soviet mosaics, like a tradition of decoration of the interiors that is very colorful. And then we have examples of the classical Baroque church, that is St. Andrew's Church, situated in Kiev on Andriivsky descent. And if we put together traditional Baroque church with traditional house, Ukrainian countryside house, we will get Ukrainian Baroque architecture. That for me is also one of the favorites because this covering of one white color, it puts this decoration not so weird as for me, and it make more comfortable to feel myself comfortable near this architecture. And this decoration is from St. Sophia Tower, and during 1920s until the 1960s, Stefan Taranushenko, he was art historian, but he also studied architecture, and exactly church architecture, and even more, exactly wooden architecture of the left bank of Ukraine. And they have their trips, research trips, all across this territory, and they were making photo shooting at that time, and drawings, and taking all dimensions of these churches. And it's a very interesting topic because we know that wooden church is always under damaging because of the wood and of course because of the fire. But we see on these photos and in his books, I think the greatest examples of the wooden churches in the left bank Ukrainian territory, that unfortunately a lot of this didn't exist nowadays. And our famous also tower in Kievo-Pecherskaya Lavra and St. Volodymyrsky Cathedral. So this kind of architecture, it was always changing according to the new waves of architecture. For example, this one was built in the second half of the 19th century when architects started also to play with historical styles from the architecture. And this one is from the 1912 project of Vladislav Gorodetsky, and this is example of a new combination of a new renovation of neo-Gothic architecture, and even those you can see like church from the fairy tale. This one was made by Shushev, and I hope it still exists. It is situated in Kharkiv region. And somehow this book, Orthodox Chic, is ironic, of course, but we see that this irony from our point of view started already at the beginning of the 20th century. So we see the example of ship of churches that was at that time. And of course, during 20s and 30s, there was a huge wave of demolishing churches. And for example, in Kiev was burned out 150 churches. And during the Soviet period, church was closed, and it was used only also as irony. For example, this is one of the projects during the competition of a new building to the railway station in Kiev, and it was not the favorite project. So it was criticized in an architectural magazine that it's so boring and so non-interesting that all we need is to add a cross on it, and it became a church. And this is example of reuse of the church. This is Museum of Space of Cosmonauts, not far away from Kiev, that exists in an old wooden church, and it's still open. And I hope after war everybody of you could enjoy this one. And of course, return to this project, Memory Hall, that during the Soviet period when architects cannot build any church, this project is the example of temple, maybe somehow connected to a church. And I told, I think, a lot about this project during my previous lectures. But I think that unfortunately Ukrainian architects, they didn't produce like a new form of architecture as we know, for example, in Poland, yeah, and like architecture of the Seventh Day, when it was combination of the modernism architecture and church cathedral typology. But our architects, after independence, getting independence of Ukraine, they started to renovate it, everything that was built, that was ruined, and they started to renovate it exactly in the same project conditions, but unfortunately the quality of the construction was not so good. And nowadays we see also some damages of this architecture, and but architects trying to invent something new to this Orthodox architecture. But unfortunately, I don't think that is a new words and a new manifest to this architecture. They just playing with forms and standing on the same point. But there is exception, this one and other examples of Orthodox Catholic Church, because it's not so strict as Orthodox, and it has that tradition, like modernity tradition, even inside the church structure. So the architecture of these cathedrals are more architectural, if we could say, and this one is one of my favorite. It's in Kiev, but I think it will be even better if it will be in this condition, like on the left photo, it will be still in the concrete. And this is church project of Janusz Wik. We see an example of a glass church. And this photo was taken by me during 2001 or 2. That is like improvement of for me that I tried to fix this new typology even 20 years ago. So this cross was added like on a free space in a residential district, and it was surrounded by shopping malls and McDonald's. But this photo, as I mentioned, was taken in 2001 and 2, but later it became a reality even. And this is installation by our artist Zhana Kadyrova, that she's playing also with this dome that you can add it even to tent, and it became also a church. And this one is installation of Sasha Kurmas, who is co-author of our book Orthodox Chic. It's in Berlin, and I think it still exists even nowadays because he made this installation 2 months ago. So nowadays, church became somehow like a supermarket. You can enter it, buy a dome, a cupola, add it to any form you want, and it became a church. Or you can buy already made church, and builders will help you to build it up. And traveling across Ukraine, of course, I saw a lot of examples of this unexpected vernacular architecture that sometimes is so beautiful as for me, and I think it's one of the best representation of the architecture of the Ukraine. For example, this one is situated in the Dnipro, and they added across to this hangar and praying inside, and everything is okay. And this one cross was added to this technical station. This technical station is situated near the Dnipro River, near a new canal that goes to eastern part of Ukraine. So there is in front this building, there is like a small lake, and the owner decided that he decided that he could produce there like a fish production, I don't know, fish business in this lake. And he decided, if I will make money on fish, Jesus, okay, I need to add a cross to this building. And he added a cross to another of his building. Or, for example, this one. Unfortunately, I didn't enter it inside. We just could imagine what the interior is inside. But for me, these examples of architecture like this, like vegans or something else, it's more similar to the religious and to a praying, to one human who believes, because you don't need all this decoration inside huge cathedrals. You need to be one-to-one with God, and you can hide in a cave or you can visit something like this. And of course, churches became another, for sure, element in new residential building districts, and sometimes these projects are still on a hold. Because I think they will never end it and finished, because we have a lot of examples when popes of church or monastery, they, for example, trying to bring some stones exactly from the Greek islands where was the first Christians, and it costs too much money, and of course sometimes money ends and it will be unfinished. This one is situated in Scientific Institute, another example of a combination of Soviet period and new reality, and of course adding church everywhere. This one is the best example, I think, of typology that I even can call it. It's in Cherkasy, and this building, according to the project, should be in the form of a pigeon. On the left, you see, but maybe we will see it someday. And of course, vernacular kind of crosses and architecture all over Ukraine. And you see, what I was filming 20 years ago nowadays exists already in Kiev. And this was the second part of this series of Chicks, and we see that this architecture is made not for centuries, as for example St. Sophia Cathedral, but it's made like a temporary temples. And this one on the left photo is the owner that added cross near the lake. He added to another building this kind of cross. And the third series should be about dachas, another representation of vernacular architecture in Ukraine, and I hope we will publish it after the war. Thank you. Maybe you have questions. And I have a video about Orthodox. Sound?
схиляємо голови наші. Отче, прости провини наші та провини батьків, дідів і прадідів наших. Прийми нині, благаємо Тебе, щиру молитву нашу і подяку нашу за безмежне милосердя Твоє до нас. Вислухай наші молитви і прийми благання сердець наших. Благослови нашу батьківщину, Україну, долю та щастя їй дай.
Relates to the wild period in the 90s. I wanted to ask, because we also experienced Kiev in it, but it's the last couple of years, there is a kind of a renewed interest in town planning, or organized planning, public space, public housing for use, also that's doing more detailed urban planning, developing the processes, planning processes, how citizens, all the different actors come together and think of things. And I wanted to ask you, as well as in planning, building, and public management, all of this, with the renewal of the process, like that as well. Here, or if the wild years
This wild wonderland period, it finished mostly in 2008 because of the financial crisis. And a lot of studios of these architects, they were closed also. And there was like a pause in normal architectural life in Ukraine till 2000, maybe till the Maidan period even. But after Maidan, yes, of course, there was some renovation in a good way of architectural urban planning. And of course, everything in life is going further and changing. And we have some good examples of these new changes in architectural life. For example, if you know Kharkiv Architectural School, that was opened 4 or 3 years ago. And it's maybe not it's about exactly urban planning, but it's about architectural and urban education that we can get benefits a little bit later. But it's very important because our architectural education is still it will be better if it's in a post-Soviet period, but sometimes it's even Soviet, you know, unfortunately. But about process exactly in a city, there are, I can answer in one way. Yes, we have more transparent relationship between developers and neighborhoods and public Of course, because of social media, but also we have the same examples of building processes that are held in under the doors, in cabinets, and is without any discussions, without any, I don't know, dialogues. And unfortunately, after Klitschko became a mayor of the city, a lot of processes, uncontrolled urban development started. So somebody called Klitschko like a mayor of developers, or developers major. For example, during this wild period in Kiev, there was architectural like presentation of each project in main architectural office of the city, and architects shows his new project, and other architects or even public or journalists, they were discussing this project. Of course, was not for sure that everything will be changed according the comments during this discussion, but it was. And after 2008, it was closed, and there is no more examples where you can discuss any of new project. It happens some days, somewhere, and nobody knows. You can later see a publication in a social media that there is a new project exactly on this plot. But new developers, they also started to deal with young urbanists, for example. They given them tasks just to make some research exactly on this territory. And they bringing them in front for the public, saying that, well, we are working with young generation of urbanism. Everything is okay. It's just decision after their research that we can put here something like this or else. So I could tell you that it became much more transparent nowadays, but of course there are changes in a good way. And I think mostly good changes in the quality of the construction and the quality of the typology, because new developers, they also try to invite new generation of clients and customers that didn't want to live in a multi-story residential blocks or skyscrapers. They want to live in a normal European residential districts with 5 or not more than 7 story buildings. And we have such a famous developer group that is called Saga, and they've made a new residential territory on the island on the Dnipro River in Kiev, and they sold out everything, make advertising of this project exactly as it is the example of good European quality architecture. But before 2010, there was one of the most important projects of the Kiev, like the whole city development, because exactly on this island was a lot of projects to make like a Kiev city. And to bring there all government stuff, all business, and to make much more free space in the center of the city. Because nowadays it's too much pressure of urban life in the center part of Kiev, because we have government, office of president, and other institutions and offices exactly in the central part of Kiev, and it's overloaded. So there was the project to bring everything exactly on this island. But maybe it could be the answer. That's if it will be a transparent and normal development of the city development, of course, on that island should be something more public than a private territory, but of course of more quality European kind of architecture. So it's 50-50 maybe, I don't know. But I hope that after the war, there will be a great opportunity to rethink our cities and to bring something completely new because there will be a lot of difficult tasks for architects and exactly urban planning, I think. And it's even, I think it will be better to redefine ourselves, redefine our society, and redefine our relationships between each other. And as a result, it will be architecture, but not architecture as a form, as you know, like Norman Foster already started his renovation of Kharkiv. So it seems like more a joke than a true. For me as a Ukrainian. Thank you.